Hey, shalom, shalom, Israel. We are back and we're starting a new little series on counting to Shabuot or the Feast of Weeks. Some know it as Pentecost. And we just finished a short series on the Sabbath resurrection made simple. And unfortunately, a lot of people struggle with it because they don't understand how to count to Shavuot. This is kind of foundational to understanding the Sabbath resurrection, and specifically not just the Sabbath resurrection, the first Sabbath resurrection. And to understand that, you got to know how to count the Omer. And within the Christian world, and I would say a high percentage of the Hebrew roots movement, they don't know this, but they are counting the Omer like the Sadducees. Now, what's the problem with that? The Sadducees, for one, were rebuked by Messiah for not knowing the scriptures and the power of Elohim. They specifically did not believe in the resurrection. And I find this ironic that most in the Hebrew roots movement follow the teachings of the Sadducees when it comes to counting the Omer and trying to prove the death, burial, resurrection of Yahushua Messiah. So we're going to walk through this and unpack this. We're going to be spending some time in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, which is the primary chapter that goes through the appointed times of Yah. But we're going to look at the beginning of it, verses 1 through 22. Now, I'm going to keep these videos really short, so we're going to break things down and just walk through it because this topic is really important because if we don't understand this, we're not going to fully understand the death, burial, and resurrection of Yahushua Messiah. Therefore, we're not going to understand the true good news, and we won't be able to arrive at our next festival, which is all about spirit and truth. If we're going to arrive at this festival that deals with spirit and truth, then we got to know what the truth is. So we got to go back and dig into the Word and see what it says. The big picture is this. Counting to Shavuot is like a time bridge that connects the festival of unleavened bread to the festival of weeks. We read in Acts 2:1 that when the day of the festival of weeks had come, they were all with one mind and in one place. See, they were on the same page. These are people coming from all over the place to this very specific festival. In order for that to happen, they would have needed to start counting from the same day. Looking a little bit closer at this time bridge, we can see that it consists of three major parts. We can also think of it as wheels within wheels. The bigger wheel made up of 50 days. A lot of people know this festival as Pentecost. The middle wheel could be considered 7 sevens or 7 weeks. And we also see the inner wheel as 7 Sabbaths. So in counting the Shabuot, we will see these three aspects as that part of that time bridge that connects the festival of unleavened bread to the festival of weeks. We'll be covering this in detail as we go through this series. To understand the counting to Shavuot, we need to go back to that primary text found in Leviticus chapter 23 and really get the context. And so I'm going to read the first 4 verses of that chapter and go from there. And Yahuwah spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, The appointed times of Yahuwah, which you are to proclaim as set apart gatherings, my appointed times are these. 6 days work is done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath rest, a set apart gathering. You do no work. It is a Sabbath to Yahuwah in all your dwellings. These are the appointed times of Yahuwah, set apart gatherings, which you are to proclaim at their appointed times. I want you to take note of how verse 2 at the end and verse 4, how they're very similar. It's almost like Yah repeating himself about his appointed times. Notice they're his appointed times. They're not Jewish. They're not necessarily even Israelite. They're his appointed times that he wants us to press into and actually keep. But notice as we look at this chapter, you're going to see there's a separation here by these phrases, my appointed times are these, where we see the 6 days of work and the seventh day Sabbath is separated from the annual Sabbaths. And we'll get into that as we read the next 4 verses. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, between the evenings, is the Passover to Yahuwah. And on the 15th day of this month is the festival of unleavened bread to Yahuwah. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you have a set apart gathering, you do no servile work. And you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yahuwah for 7 days. And on the seventh day is a set apart gathering, you do no servile work. Take notice how these dates are fixed to the month or the moon, and these are calculated by the sighting of the new moon. You count out 14 days, Passover. The very next day, the 15th, starts the festival of unleavened bread through the 21st of the month. That would be the seventh day of unleavened bread. Note that the first day and the seventh day, no servile work is done. When we look at all 8 of these verses in context, we can see that Yah has set apart the weekly Sabbath from the other annual Moedim. And specifically, even in these 8 verses, we can see that the first day of unleavened bread, the 15th, and the last day, the seventh day of unleavened bread, the 21st day of the month, are both considered high Sabbaths. There are high Sabbaths throughout this chapter that are distinct from the weekly Sabbath. And this point is really important by being able to understand the counting of the Omer, because we're going to need to make judgment calls on, is it talking about a weekly Sabbath? Is it talking about an annual Sabbath? And getting confused on this can lead to wrong conclusions. And we'll get into this more as we go through this series. I don't want to get off on too many rabbit trails, but I wanted to make an example of where people can not rightly divide the word of truth, distinguishing between weekly Sabbaths and the annual Moedim. And one of the great, I guess, a great example of this is with the lunar Sabbath theory. There's 2 primary theories with this, and I'll try to explain as best I can. I'm not going to get into all the details, but long story short, a lot of people believe that there is no week count. There was no, basically there's no week going back to creation. They understand the Sabbaths as being strictly with the moon as well. Like you got the new moon, then you count out 7 days, and that's a Sabbath. And the 14th day, which is normally a full moon, that's a Sabbath, and the 21st and the 28th. And that's one theory within the lunar Sabbath group. There's another group that goes by the eighth day, the lunar month, the 15th, the 22nd, the 29th. And so they're strictly going by the moon as they're counting their Sabbaths. There's no distinction between a weekly Sabbath and then the annual Moedim that are based off the moons. They just kind of clump this all together. But we'll be able to show real quickly how the math doesn't add up. We just got done looking at verses 7 and 8 in Leviticus 23, where it says the first day you do no work, basically a high Sabbath. And the seventh day, this is talking about the unleavened bread. The first day of unleavened bread is on the 15th, and the last day of unleavened bread is on the 21st. These are both high Sabbaths. Let's see if the lunar Sabbath theory if we have Sabbaths on these days. Now notice on theory 1, it has a Sabbath on day 14 of the moon, but according to verse 7, the first day of unleavened bread is a Sabbath, so that's the 15th. So theory 1 doesn't line up with verse 7. We also see in theory 2, it has the 15th, but it has the 22nd as also a Sabbath, where in verse 8 of Leviticus 23, it says the seventh day, which is the 21st, is a Sabbath. So theory 2 doesn't line up with verse 8. And neither one of them line up with the Day of Atonement, which is on the 10th day of the 7th month. And there's a lot of other issues too. But I just wanted to show this, like if you can't properly separate weekly Sabbaths from the annual Sabbaths, you can get really confused and come up with a lot of interesting, strange theories out there. So long story short, this is why math is so important, because math is really hard science. It does not bend, and really it can just slice through a lot of these theories And just like the Good Friday to Easter Sunday, it just doesn't add up. So when we see things that don't add up, we need to dismiss them and really press into what the scripture is actually saying and walk like Yahushua Messiah walked. We'll be getting into this more. Just we're going to break this down little by little and unpack it because we want to arrive at the Festival of Weeks, which is all about spirit and truth. Shalom.